You know, when the Berlin Wall came down in '89, it really felt like that was it, the end of a story. The Cold War was over, freedom had won. But what if that wasn't the whole picture? What if we never actually finished the fight? One man who paid a truly incredible price for speaking out believed exactly that. Let's dive into his warning. This quote from the Soviet dissident Vladimir Bukovsky, man, it just gets right to the absolute core of what totalitarianism is all about. It wasn't enough to control your body. They wanted your soul. They demanded that you not only obey, but that you actually love your own oppression. And if you can wrap your head around that, you can start to understand his warning. So here's what we're going to dive into. We'll look at Bukovsky's incredible life, his main argument about why the Cold War victory was incomplete, and the consequences he saw playing out in modern Russia. Then we'll get to his most startling argument, a parallel he drew with the European Union. And finally, we'll ask why he believed this war of ideas is still going on today. Okay, so to really get what Bukovsky was warning us about, we first have to look at the triumphant story we all remember and then contrast it with a brutal reality that he actually lived. This was the story we all told ourselves, right? The Soviet Union just dissolved. Communism got tossed into the dustbin of history, and liberal democracy was crowned the undisputed champ. It felt like a clean, decisive victory. End of story. But then there was Vladimir Bukovsky. And he saw something totally different. And his opinion, well, it carries some serious weight. This wasn't some academic theory for him. This was his life. He spent more than a decade in the Soviet Gulag system, including their twisted psychiatric wards, just for asking for basic human rights. That kind of courage, it gives his warning a really chilling credibility. And you really can't understand his argument without understanding his life. I mean, it was a lifetime of pure resistance against a system that was specifically designed to crush people like him. I mean, look at this. The guy's resistance started when he was just a kid, and it never, ever stopped. Kicked out of school at 16, arrested at 20, and then for the next 14 years, he was just stuck in this revolving door of prisons and forced psychiatric treatment. But even in that hell, he was still fighting back, smuggling out hundreds of pages of documents that blew the lid off these abuses to the rest of the world. Every single time they let him out, he went right back to fighting for change. And that leads to this just unbelievable story from 1992. After the Soviet Union fell apart, Bukovsky gets access to these top-secret Soviet archives. But there's a catch. He can read whatever he wants, but he can't make any copies. So what does he do? He smuggles in a brand new laptop and a hand scanner. The guards had never seen technology like this before. They had no clue what he was up to. So he just sat there right under the noses of former Politburo members and quietly scanned thousands of secret KGB files. I mean, that perfectly captures his genius and his absolute obsession with getting the truth out. So, this lifelong fight, this obsession with the truth, that's what brings us to his main point, that the West's victory in the Cold War was not just incomplete, it was dangerously incomplete. See, Bukovsky's big thesis was this. The Cold War wasn't just about missiles and spies. It was a war of ideas. And on that front, he said, we never actually won. It was more like one side just collapsed from exhaustion, and we decided to call it a day. The core ideas, the ideology itself, was never truly defeated. And that brings up a really powerful question, doesn't it? I mean, after World War II, the entire Nazi regime was put on trial at Nuremberg. Its ideology was publicly judged and condemned as criminal for the whole world to see. So, why didn't that happen to the Soviet communist system? And the answer, at least according to the secret documents Bukovsky got his hands on, is just shocking. It wasn't just the new Russian leaders pushing back. He claimed there was enormous pressure from Western governments not to hold a trial. Why? Because opening up those archives would expose decades of deep ideological collaboration between left-wing parties in the West and the Soviet Union. So without that big moral judgment, Bukovsky warned that the old system could just come crawling back, and he saw the direct fallout from this incomplete victory in the Russia that started to take shape in the 21st century. And you really don't have to look far for the proof. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer himself, famously called the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Now, that's not the language of a leader embracing a new democratic chapter. That's the language of someone who wants to turn back the clock. And this wasn't just talk. It had a real terrifying human cost. Just look at this number, 62. In the 8 years leading up to Bukovsky's warning, that's how many journalists were murdered in Russia. And in almost every single one of those cases, nobody was brought to justice. To Bukovsky, the message was crystal clear. Political murder was back on the table as a tool of the state. Okay, but this is where Bukovsky's argument takes a really surprising turn. He said that because this communist ideology was never really defeated, it was free to, well, to mutate. And he believed he saw it popping up again in the most unexpected place, Western Europe. I mean, think about it. From his point of view, as someone who spent his entire life fighting one unelected, unaccountable, bureaucratic superstate, he was absolutely horrified to see what he thought was another one being built, this time in the form of the European Union. He started drawing these direct lines between the two. He looked at the unelected Politburo in the Soviet Union and saw a mirror image in the unelected European Commission. He looked at the KGB, this police force above the law, and saw an echo in Europol, whose officers, he pointed out, had diplomatic immunity. And in both, he saw this relentless drive for constant expansion. And this was the really critical part for him. He pointed to what he saw as new ideological crimes. He highlighted how EU authorities had actually explained that a term like xenophobia could be used to prosecute people who opposed the political project of more European integration. To him, that was just criminalizing political disagreement. And for him, you could see this crazy, unaccountable power pop up in the most absurd ways. He would talk about these bizarre EU directives, things like mandating that pigs have to be given colored balls because they get bored, or telling people how often their garbage could be collected. For him, these were perfect examples of a bureaucratic machine that the people it governed just couldn't question or control. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway from Bukovsky's life and his stark warning to all of us? It all comes down to this. Because there was no Nuremberg for communism, that ideology was never really judged as criminal. So the system wasn't truly defeated. It just kind of fizzled out. And that left its core ideas, like centralized control by an unelected elite and the crushing of dissent, free to mutate and pop up somewhere else. But, Bukovsky wasn't about despair. He believed that what the governments failed to do, well, we, the people, could still do it. By gathering documents, by sharing the stories, by insisting on a moral judgment of the past. He believed we could create that public trial that never happened, and maybe finally finish that war of ideas. And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. If Bukovsky was right, if that fundamental battle between individual liberty and centralized, unaccountable power never really ended, where do you see that same fight happening in the world today?